Hello, everyone, and I'm glad that you can join us on today's webinar. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm glad um, to be able to bring to you the concluding part of this two-part webinar on how to really keep yourself safe online. I'm talking about digital security, and it's something that we began. It's a journey that we began last week, and it's something that has actually been from the responses and interactions that we've had, the conversations, the questions and answers that we've had from different participants, and the presentations that we've had to really showed that this is really critical at this moment in time. And that is the conversation that we are taking forward today. And so digital security is not something that anybody struggles to understand. As you work online more increasingly since the COVID-19 pandemic began, we are leaving more footprints on social media and in places where it is becoming extremely difficult for journalists to carry out their activities and to report the news independently without fear. There is a need for them to be empowered with how to keep themselves safe online. And so that's what we'll be looking at today to in our concluding part of this webinar. And we have the same uh, extraordinarily amazing speaker that we had last week with us. Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me yet again. Good
Yeah,
morning
yeah. Good morning, and
from
thanks
New
for
York, at least.
oh yeah, so in some parts of the world it's afternoon. I know in Nigeria it's afternoon. In India it's late in the evening. So wherever you are joining us, we say thank you. We really appreciate you joining us in this series of webinars that are meant to improve the skills of journalists in the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you are joining us on the Facebook live stream and you have any question, I encourage you to put the questions in the Facebook chat in the Facebook comment box below the live stream. And if you are joining us live on the Zoom platform, I encourage you to use the Q&A option on the Zoom platform. So before we take Hello's presentation, I would like to know who we have today. So I want to know how many participants participated in last week's session. So I want to know, did you attend last week's session? Click yes and no, so that so our speaker can have an idea of the distribution of those that are in attendance today. So interestingly, almost half of our participants today were here last week, and almost half are new. So, hello, are you ready for a presentation?
I am, and I am so happy to do this with you once again. All right, so I'm going to go share my screen. Hold on 1 second. There it should be. Oh, no, not that one. Actually, I wanted to do another one. Yes. Okay. Does everyone see a slide that says chat mastery?
Oh yes, yes.
Great. Okay, cool. So now I'm actually going to turn off my video just to save my bandwidth here, and we're gonna continue where we left off. Okay, so you might recall a couple of slides ago. Whoops, we're gonna go backwards. I mentioned that end-to-end encryption is incredibly important because unlike all of the other ways of looking at, like how data flows over the internet, sometimes in addition to having that excellent, transport between yourself, the friends that you're talking to, and the provider that you're working with, if that's like, Signal or Facebook or something like that, you definitely don't also want them to have access to the content of what you're saying. And we're going to talk about the legal implications of a provider having access to that content and how to prevent that. But that's the reason why that's important, is because this introduces this new principle called end-to-end encryption that really does help you protect the conversations that transpire on your phone. So a lot of people are like, okay, I heard this term end-to-end encryption, and this is why you should use Signal or WhatsApp or even certain instances of Facebook Messenger. That's true. And that said, though, I do want to show you exactly why that's important and what it actually means under the hood. Meaning that what you're looking at right now in this slide is actually an example of an end-to-end encrypted conversation that took place on a Google service between me and my friend Rose. However, there's a couple of things that you might notice. So if ever Google were to be subpoenaed, or rather given an order of production or a court order or something like that, that they couldn't successfully fight in order to get the content of our conversation, this is exactly what Google would have to hand out, because it's only my phone and Rose's phone that actually have the keys, the mathematic keys, the cryptographic keys to turn what you see that is obviously gibberish and turn it into something legible that can be read, by a lawyer or by a judge. But that said, it still has a lot of interesting things that are not encrypted at all that somebody can still make use of. So for instance, we know that Harlo is talking to Rose because our usernames are definitely here. We know that, this conversation took place at around 2:05 p.m., probably on the East Coast, because we have timestamps about when everybody was, talking. And we also know how people are communicating. You can tell because every, what we like to call stanza of this conversation starts with $OTR:, and that means that we're using a specific protocol in order to communicate. So if you're thinking of how journalists speak, when we have when you're reporting, you have the who, what, when, where, why, and how. We definitely have the who, we definitely do have the when, we definitely do have the how. And so that still means that, there's a lot of information that somebody can use against people in a conversation of interest. But one of the reasons why this is so important to use anyways is that it shifts the balance of power. Not only does it mean that Google or, Signal or Facebook or whatever can't read the content of your messages, it also means that if ever there is some sort of retaliation and you find yourself part of a legal investigation, the legal teams are going to have to ask your active participation in order to flesh out their case, rather than you being swooped up, thrown into court, and then a judge reading out loud something that you said and you had no clue that had entered into evidence. So this is why we're really enthusiastic about Signal. Always going to rep Signal until Signal is no more. If you haven't already started using Signal, please do start using it. It's available on all platforms, including, your computers, meaning your laptops and desktops and things like that. And right now, I think that, we're going to go through the caveats, but this is actually this should be considered a building block in your toolkit for, just communications, especially with sources, especially within your investigative units, especially as you're handling logistics. And one of the reasons why has to do with the way that, in addition to end-to-end encryption, Signal also has a very, very light touch on that metadata that I was explaining before. But that said, Sometimes the Signal protocol, which we think is the best, is perhaps not the best option. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think out of the box about like how useful a particular tool is in order to have a conversation. So Signal is great, but ask yourself, does my source have access to that tool? If your source, and actually this is something that we hear with people working with folks in Afghanistan as they're transitioning to Taliban control. The fact that Signal is on someone's phone might arouse suspicion. And so in which case, if someone has physical access to your phone and can see you using Signal, then perhaps that's not the best tool. You also want to make sure that you can trust the tool and to see if that particular tool maker is doing well by its customer base in order to protect their privacy. And that has international implications. So in order to I showed you, this bullet point list of, things to think about, but another way of thinking about these things are in what I like to call this matrix. A lot of people might have seen this before, but I think it's an important tool for people to have to think through all of the tools that are available. So for every tool that you encounter, as long as it, ticks off certain base standards, think about this in a matrix from where we have on our vertical axis, what does the job well in terms of maintaining confidentiality on a conversation, and what really, really fails you. So we know that Signal and WhatsApp, which you see here, are actually pretty good in providing end-to-end encryption. They have robust, security in terms of not letting messages get plucked out of the air by law enforcement. There's ways to trust, that you're talking to the person that you want to talk to, which is great. But Signal and WhatsApp differ, even though they have the same end-to-end encryption baked into them, in that WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. And so they have more insight into conversations. For instance, if a conversation is reported and flagged for abuse, then Facebook actually is allowed to jump in and view some of the messages that are in that conversation. So that's a little bit worrying. There's also metadata because it's Facebook. But you also need to consider that other axes are horizontal axis where, as I mentioned before, what if people are not going to be able to use Signal and WhatsApp is pretty much the best thing that they can do, given the fact that WhatsApp is so ubiquitous and it won't arouse suspicion. And that's just one use case. You might be speaking to people who, whose own families look at their phones and would be suspicious if they saw Signal. Or you might be talking to somebody who, can't access an app store in order to download the tool that you want. So the thing about WhatsApp, though, is that there had been in the past, precedent where certain apps will take backups of your chats and put them in storage, like your Google Drive account or in your iCloud account. And for time, WhatsApp actually did this by default. And so even despite the really excellent end-to-end encryption that was introduced into WhatsApp, if you have backups that somebody can get from out of your iCloud, then that is actually very problematic. Thankfully, this happened in the past, and based off of lessons learned, WhatsApp is going to provide encrypted backups now. But that said, that's an example of a mistake that can be made, and so what's interesting about that is it introduces complexity as far as patterns of usage is concerned, meaning that you and your sources and the people that you collaborate with have to think very hard about the choices around usage of a particular app, not just the choice to use an app. I hope that makes sense. And of course, drop your questions in the chat, and Paul and Stella will make sure that I get them. So to continue this metaphor, let's talk about Facebook Messenger. Even though this is being live streamed on Facebook, it's still worth mentioning that Facebook Messenger does have end-to-end encryption similar to Signal and WhatsApp, but it's only in certain parts of the chat experience. It's not like overall. So there are secret messages, and then there are regular messages, which is awesome if you, one, know how to use them properly, know where to access them, and also remember things like if you are, if you switch to your desktop and you're, using Facebook chat on like the web interface, it's not available to you. There are a whole bunch of other, platforms that I really, really love to talk through along this metric. I guess for international audiences, one thing that people really love are, there's a couple. One is Telegram, which has a similar, challenge as Facebook Messenger does, in that people don't often realize that Telegram is end-to-end encrypted only currently in the one-to-one chats that you might have. As far as group chats and broadcasts and things like that, they're not end-to-end encrypted. But we do like the fact that Telegram does have a pretty positive stance towards advocating for people's right to privacy on the platform, and that does give them pretty high marks. And there are certain cases, especially given how like ubiquitous, once again, Telegram is, where that might be an appropriate place to take your conversation. On our gold standard quadrant number 1, I also included a service called Wire, which actually is pretty cool in that it's like business oriented. And so a lot of European audiences find that to be a pretty cool solution. They're still working out, a lot of their difficulties, their challenges as far as like the experience is concerned, but it actually does do a lot of what we want as far as offering end-to-end encryption and offering privacy as far as metadata is concerned. But down in our no-no quadrant, which is quadrant number 3, if you recall your geometry, we have SMS messages and we have Slack. Slack is not end-to-end encrypted. It's not going to be. There is an option to do that, but it comes at a price point that is so high that the majority of the organizations that you work with are not going to be able to enroll in that tier in order to get end-to-end encryption. So you're probably going to be on a Slack channel that has absolutely no end-to-end encryption. And Slack does not, they really don't fight and advocate for their users as much as they should in order to protect their privacy when the law comes knocking at their door. They really, really don't. But finally, we have the worst, which is just plain old text messages. And the reason, the reason why is because phones are so complicated, and we've gotten so far in having like cell phones and stuff that like there's all sorts of old legacy, protocols that are not in touch with how we need to use phones today. And so that means that SMS messages are never going to be encrypted at all. Everybody, it's pretty much like, actually, my colleague used this excellent metaphor the other day. It's pretty much like if you were using a walkie-talkie, where like everybody who's like dialed into the specific channel, they can hear what you're saying. And so not only that, but like the way that different international telecommunication providers handle text messages means that everybody's going to see your text messages. So if you ever have sensitive communications, or if you ever have a source whose phone number you do not want anyone to know that you have, you should not use text messages at all, and just take it immediately to one of these other services that are in our like top tiers of privacy. Okay, so I'm going to blaze through this because I know we have a lot of questions and we also have a lot of content. Ultimately, as you look at this slide, I will highlight what I think is most important, is that you use disappearing messages and set them, especially in groups, immediately as you start chatting in that group, because you never want to be walking around with the phone in your pocket and, let's say, approach like, a border crossing or about to get on a plane, or, like entering through customs and wonder if there's something that somebody said in some obscure group that you forgot that you were part of that might arouse suspicion. We have a really excellent guide about locking down Signal in order to mitigate a number of these problems. And also, like, there are similar things available in like WhatsApp as well. Such as making sure that, media doesn't download automatically to your phone. Which is not only like, I guess, kind of like a breach of confidentiality if, like, you're thrown into a chat and someone starts sending, like images or whatever, you want to select that you can download that person's media to your phone rather than having it do it automatically. And also, exploring your options around disappearing messages, around disabling backups and things like that. Okay. As far as video conferencing, obviously, Signal and WhatsApp do have support for video conferencing for people in groups, which is awesome. On desktop, and those are also available from their desktop options. Right now, I'm on Zoom, which is pretty great too, in that it does offer end-to-end encryption for chats like these. However, all people have to be capable of handling that end-to-end encryption in order for that to work. And also the organizer of the meeting has to enable that in their account. Meaning you have to go to like zoom.us, you have to log in, you have to go through your profile settings or whatever, and then enable end-to-end encryption. And that also means that you can't like record calls, and also it's incompatible with people who need to dial in, because there's always like an option to do that. The same thing that is a really great alternative that people love is Jitsi Meet, which does not require an account of any kind. You just tell people, what the link is to that particular meeting, and they go to it, and you can enable end-to-end encryption on those calls, as long as people, like everybody on the call, can manage it. But these are pretty great options for video. Okay, let's talk about, just how we make media, especially for those of you who work in visual media. One thing that not only visual media, but also people who are doing field work. One thing that I highly do recommend, especially for like iPhone users, is to put passwords on your notes. If you are using notes to take field notes and stuff like that, you can have you can have like fully, quote unquote military grade encryption on the notes that you take, even as you sync them to your iCloud for like use on another device. So if you go into your settings, go to the Notes app, add a password to it, and also feel free to put Touch ID on that, because what we want is we want you to have like a long and complex and unique passphrase to unlock those notes, because that makes the encryption all the more stronger. But for your basic use, instead of typing out your incredibly complex passphrase to unlock your notes each time, if you feel safe enough, using your Touch ID in order to lock and unlock those things makes you really, really efficient, keeps you moving, but also gives you that security. So one thing for, especially for like visual media people, and this is something that I learned from a really awesome group called Witness, especially Palika Makam, who's just great, is that, like you're going to take a photo, you're going to take a video, you're going to stream to Facebook Live, you're going to, like, I don't know, do a TikTok or whatever. However you make your media. But that said, there are a couple of like implications regarding the people who are in front of your camera as you do so. As far as, your colleagues and, the people, I don't know, readers and viewers of your media are concerned, you could possibly take the photo that wins the Pulitzer Prize, right? However, to law enforcement and intelligence everywhere across the globe, they're looking at your media from a user-generated content perspective, in that they are scanning all of the places where your media might end up, all of the hashtags that your media is associated with, all of the virality that your media generates, and they're looking at it on very, very like data specific terms in order to further investigate the people that you have in front of your camera. So be aware of that. And also for those of you who are, like doing it old school and you have like just a basic camera with like a SD card or a compact flash, understand that there is, like certain situations where that might invite retaliation, where they'll come for things that you didn't necessarily publish or didn't post online, but they're using that to build out a case because they suspect that what's on that compact flash or SD card has more. And so you have to think about strategies for safeguarding those things, whether that's like putting them in a safe, setting your own retention policy for how long you're going to archive these things, always encrypting your archives. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do this anecdote, but ultimately, in order to find the person who is throwing this beautiful photo of someone throwing a Molotov cocktail, law enforcement, did a reverse image search on the t-shirt that this person was wearing, and then served Etsy, the store where it was purchased, for the IP address and correspondence between the person who bought the shirt and the seller. And that's how they found who this person is. So this is just a very, very basic example of how, our arts, our crafts can be viewed under certain lenses. Okay, and so, as far as that's concerned, I do want you to think about possible aspects of retaliation. That means encrypted, because you never know, after you go to story, after you publish, what is coming down, in reaction or in response to your to not necessarily to your reporting, but to your relationship with sources and others who have helped you build what you've built. So this is why encryption is very, very important. We talked about earlier the concept of full disk encryption and encryption of things like hard drives and USB sticks and other things like that. So please do that on, any of your archival material, as well as the computers that you use daily. So I know that we're talking to a very, very international crowd, but and so your mileage may vary. However, with organizations like CPJ and RCFP and Reporters Sans Frontières, all of those organizations do actively support everyone here in finding the legal representation and the advocacy that they need in order to rise themselves out of any particular hurdles that they might encounter. And there's always like kind of a low hanging, fruit type tactic of harassing people online. And so it's always like easy lifting to prepare yourself and the accounts that you have in the case of online harassment, whether those are like targeted campaigns in retaliation for something that you have published, that either could be by, like quote unquote legitimate dissenters to the story that you've told, or could be corralled by, intelligence agencies who are playing dirty tricks to make it look like, people are retaliating against you, but ultimately it's just like a tactic to intimidate. It depends on where you are. However, we have definitely seen plenty of places across the entire globe that employ such tactics to astonishing effect to get journalists to self-censor. So there are a number of organizations that do, ours included, that do provide resources about how to prepare yourself, which I guess is kind of redundant, but prepare yourself against, like online harassment, which includes, having to look at social media in order to, make sure that your privacy and security settings are optimal for the platform, and also preparing, what other the types of resources, the types of support you need from people that you work with, and also people in your personal life to handle that should the event arise. Okay, and so I was told that we're supposed to spend the last 25 minutes in questions, and in which case I'm going to hand it to Paul to lead us in that.
Thank you very much, Harlo, for that. And yes, so there are several lines of thoughts regarding the questions. And one of those questions that I think I saw last week that I think is really, really relevant for you to speak on is on how do journalists simplify their digital security tools. I know you've mentioned a number of tools that they can use, but at the barest minimum, what do you think journalists can do? For instance, especially in their reporting, what are the singular tools you can recommend that anybody anywhere can access on different outlets? So let me know what you can say about that.
Sure, that's a good question. You definitely do want to balance security with keeping things the least complicated as possible. At a very minimum, I think exploring the tools that are already available on your existing devices is key. So there's full disk encryption, making sure that you have either BitLocker or File Vault turned on your computer. For you Linux users, there's also Lux encryption. Another thing that you want to do is to make sure that you're, always keeping up with updates, because people do get targeted increasingly within this sphere with attempts to install malware on their devices. And so the best way to mitigate that, although nothing is perfect, the best way to mitigate that is to make sure that your operating systems are up to date. So even though it's really annoying when Windows in the middle of a presentation will send you into that spiraling blue screen to apply. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Yes, here. Yeah, send you spiraling into that, update cycle. You have to do it because that does mean that there, is a security issue that needs to be addressed. Another thing is, and also on your phones as well as making sure that you do that for the software that you use. Another thing to consider is, like what are the various, let's say, extensions and other pieces of software that you allow into your experience, and think about paring that down. So for instance, like if you are using Google Chrome, right, as your primary browser, that's fine. But do you also need like all of these browser extensions that might have access to, your clipboard as you're typing and things like that? If you do want to experience, extensions like that, I guess my next bit of advice is compartmentalization, thinking in tiers. This is not a piece of software. This is just a practice. Like how do you, in the tools that you use on a daily basis, enforce separate space for your work and separate space for your leisure time. Just making sure that those things are properly done goes a long way. And then from there, once you're ready, we can get into the more advanced stuff. Are there any, and also if there are any questions about like, specific tasks that you want to do, I can make some recommendations for software.
Oh, okay. So that would be really, really quite helpful. So another question that is there is, what do you say regarding if, like we said, there is a lot of things that can be done. What about the use of burner lines? What do I mean by that? If somebody just gets another SIM card, and you want to talk to sources that may not be quite aware of how to keep themselves safe, so they use burner lines or SIM cards that may not be directly connected to them. They have that conversation, and that net line is destroyed. Is that safe enough?
Well, that depends. First, it depends a lot. I can tell you where those things go wrong, and some assumptions that people have that are incorrect. So it depends on your jurisdiction, but currently there are very few countries where an ID is not required in order to get a SIM card in the first place. In the United States, you can get a SIM card without ID. In the UK, you can get a SIM card without ID. However, like in, I don't know, Tunis, you can't. In, Argentina, you can't. So like you have to understand that a separate secondary phone number. Someone can ask a telecom provider who owns that number because it's going to be linked to your identity. Also, devices do have, certain IDs on them that associate them with the SIM cards that you use, which also associate that with the person who's the subscriber. And so if you find yourself like, taking a burner phone to go meet with a source because you want to have like a conversation, but you want to bring a burner phone for communication or logistics or whatever, there are ways to associate, like the people who are meeting with one another just based off of their proximity that the telephone provider can, like always audit. So if you want, actually, I'm going to show you one of my favorite toys. I keep it right here by my desk. This is what's called a Faraday bag. And what it is it's a pouch that is lined with a certain material in it that keeps radio from from leaving or entering the pouch. And so what you can do is you can take your phone, you drop it in the bag, and you close it up. And now this actually ceases to transmit. And so I essentially like my telephone provider knows the last place that I was before I put this in the bag. But if I leave my apartment and go somewhere else, then they'll have no clue where this phone has gone until I decide to open it up again and for it to act as a phone. And so if you do want to like kind of prevent, like in time location-based tracking, that's your best bet. Hands down, just do it physically, do it the analog way. Don't try to download an app or, to fix the problem or do some geek stuff. That is probably wrong anyways. Just get it back.
Okay, so let me read this question. I'd like to know how one can know if their device has the Pegasus spyware and
Yeah.
how to guard against it.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's good news, bad news, good news again, bad news again. First and foremost, organizations like NSO Group, who are the ones that manufacture Pegasus and distribute it, are very, very motivated in continuing to do so. So every time that researchers who work on our side discover how this works and how it can be defeated, they're going to iterate and they're going to create a new version of it to sell that will be more effective until the researchers discover that again. So currently, though, ways of discovering that you have Pegasus, it depends on the device that you have. So for iOS, if you have an iPhone, there are, and also do your updates no matter what phone you have, because that's definitely the best way to protect yourself. But for iOS, there is a diagnostic tool that is done by a group called Trail of Bits that costs, actually, I don't remember what it costs. I think it costs $3 on the App Store. And there's also a free version provided by Amnesty International that have been doing some really, really excellent work. It's less user friendly. So you definitely do have to, know how to take a backup of your iPhone. You have to run the diagnostic tool on a computer that you trust, and you have to kind of know how to do it. So it's not for people who are squeamish around computers, but if you are if you want to do that, you can. It's called MT Toolkit, I believe, but don't quote me on that because I'm just remembering off the top of my head. For Android users, however, it's a lot harder because iPhones and Androids are constructed differently. But there are certain diagnostic tools, primarily tools that actually just check your text messages to see if you had received a link that is known to have hosted Pegasus in the past. And that's an easy process, but it's not 100%. And quite frankly, the next time when Pegasus comes back, it'll be worse. And also, we would be incredibly naive to think that Pegasus is the only thing out there that can get you, because that there's a number of other hacker groups out there that are building tools that are less notorious.
Okay, thank you very much. Felix from Uganda would like to know how safe is it for a journalist to use VPN? And which ones are safe for journalists?
Okay. I think VPNs are great. And actually, I spoke to someone recently in Uganda about this very, very question. So for everyone on the call, I do want to say that your access to a VPN and the legality around using a VPN is going to vary. And so, for instance, I know that in Uganda, it's perfectly fine to use a VPN and go ahead and use it. Actually, my friend said, as long as you're paying your bill to, your service provider to get your internet, you shouldn't have to worry about, your connection to a VPN being dropped under normal circumstances. I also know, however, in that region, across the board, there might be times where, your telecom provider will prevent you from accessing a VPN because, like, let's say there's an election or, something like civil unrest or something like that. That's usually kind of what they do. They're like, oh no, we're just going to block people from using these things. So your mileage may vary. As far as, and so that's just one region. In other regions, it's illegal to use a VPN, but it's actually not. It's just illegal for you to be discovered doing things that are, like very, very controversial on said VPNs and using a VPN in order to quote unquote get away with it. So like,
Okay.
it depends on where you are. As for
Okay.
suggestions, let's see. I personally like, I still like private internet access. I personally still like one called Viper a lot. I have mixed feelings about Proton VPN. I don't really care, but I mean, like, it works. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Somebody would like to know if you can repeat the name of the bag that blocks the radio wave. So what's the name?
It's called a Faraday bag.
Okay, can you just type that so
Mm-hmm.
that they can know
Yeah.
what to look out
Yeah.
for? So the next question is this, and maybe another person asked where they can get it from, so if you can provide that information too. So there is also another question from Emiliano. Okay, um, the question is this: how can I make sure I don't have a virus in my phone? Sometimes I have to encrypt and decrypt information on it.
Okay. So you do want to, uh, I don't, I, I would caution against using your phone, your primary phone, for all these purposes, if you can. But that, because once again, compartmentalization is a practice, not a tool, but it's a practice that keeps your tools as safe as possible. But that said, I do understand that sometimes for some people, that is just how you have to do it. Um, so definitely, like, only open up documents. Your signal tells you a document. Don't do that from somebody random. Get to know that person first, so you can
Okay.
at least, assume that that person is, like, interests in mind. Also, like, never. A lot of people. A lot of people keep their phones on literally, like, all the time for days.
Yeah, hello is
Malware
breaking.
actually doesn't exist. Oh, sorry. Okay, but I wanted to say something. That does not last.
Hello. Okay, so while we get hello back, so um, I've been seeing some questions regarding the previous, the first part of this digital security training. So if you go to the ICFJ's YouTube page, the video for last session is already there, and I encourage you to check it out. It's quite extensive and thorough. So please check out the video on the ICFJ YouTube page. Everything is there in full, and I think Hello is back.
Yes. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, it's better now.
Okay. I wanted to say reboot your phone, actually. Get into the habit of rebooting your phone, often, because the majority of malware on phones does not last on reboot. And so they would have to
Oh,
reinfect you again and
wow.
again and again. So, like, yeah, reboot your phone a couple of, like whenever makes sense for you. That's not to say that like one day you'll come across something that's entirely like really, really strong. But for, like really simple malware, that helps.
Oh, okay. So Johnson would like to know, with regard to Google account, what's the way to go when all security steps, changing passwords and two-step verification when they fail? What do you recommend?
So I highly recommend those practices, and using a password manager to keep your passwords unique, even on Google, using also saving your backup codes when you enable two-factor authentication so you don't accidentally get locked out of your Google account if the primary way that you do two-factor fails you. And for me, I like the primary factor of using. Uh, so there's an app that is really awesome. There's two that I like. One is Google's Authenticator. It's great. The other one is Authy, which is fabulous. Um, and yeah, and then there's like a couple of other ones that are really great too. That if you have any questions about my opinion on them, I'd be more than happy to weigh.
Yeah, before asking Hello more questions, I have a question for our audience too. So, I'd like to know if you've heard any of the digital security tools that Halo has mentioned before today's webinar. I want to know what you know. Um, so while we do that, okay, while the questions, the answers come in, hello, there is a question that I think you should also take. Do you recommend the burner phone along with the RF pouch in certain situations?
Um, well, that can definitely be, yeah, that can definitely be useful. I think that if so, as I showed in that demonstration, having a burner phone in or using the Faraday pouch means that like if you're traveling to meet someone, then you can protect where that phone is going. But also just remember that if you live in a place where your ID is required in order to get a second SIM card, then it's still going to be linked to you. And so this is why, using apps that don't necessarily require you to have, people in your contacts provide disappearing messages, etc., on that burner phone is equally important. And so as long as you can manage all of those requirements, I think that that's a perfectly fine thing to do.
Yeah, so the result of the poll we just had showed that only 59% of participants have heard about the digital security tools you've
That's
mentioned.
great.
So
That's a
what
good
do you
number though.
think? What do you think this says about journalists' awareness of digital security?
I think that's really promising. I really, really do. And now 100% of you have heard about the tools, and I think that that's the goal. Um, yeah, I think that we do have like a long way to go, but this is incredibly promising, and I thank you so much for putting together forums like these where we can share that knowledge. Uh, yeah.
Oh, okay. Don't go into vote of thanks yet. You still have questions. So Emiliano would also is, but okay. Let me take Emiliano's question. Does it provide more security if I encrypt the information first, and then the encrypted data is sent through Signal or even Proton Mail?
Mhm. Yeah. Absolutely. That said, Signal and Proton Mail will encrypt that data for you, which is what makes them as simple to use. However, if you don't have the ability to use Signal or Proton Mail, and also do know that like Proton Mail only works between two Proton Mail users. So if you are using Proton Mail and you send something to somebody on like Gmail or like, you know, Hotmail, it's not going to work. It's not going to be encrypted. You're going to have to find another way to independently encrypt that data before sending it. There are a variety of tools out there that can help you do it. Some actually, one of the most simple ones is something called Tresorit Send. So hold on, it's called Tresorit, ESORIT. So that actually allows you to, you know, send files to people via like an emailed link, and that is end-to-end encrypted. There's also something called Onion Share, which is a program that you need to use with the Tor browser in order to send or receive files. You can even use it to chat, blah, 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 blah. And it's technically not end-to-end encrypted, but it is in that because it works over Tor, there is a direct encrypted, multi-encrypted connection between anybody who's accessing, accessing that data.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so thank you. There is one question that I also have for you, and it has to do with digital security for news platforms, especially for media entrepreneurs that are really not as big as the giant ones, those that are just starting out on their own but cannot afford to employ a full-time digital security official. I remember when I was around like 4 or 5 years ago, I was working with a health news platform, and all of a sudden, the platform was suffered a major cyber attack that actually dealt with all the published pieces on the platform. So, which means for those that are not really conversant with digital security, what tips can you give on how to secure easily, affordably, cheaply, and quickly secure their platforms?
I would recommend being very, very careful about people's use of Google stuff. Meaning the first investment that I would make is to, you know, like actually, like if you are going to use Google, as people often do, I mean, there are alternatives, but they're not necessarily easy, but if you are going to use Google, invest in having like a administered Google account for your domain that covers your email and your documents and your calendars and things like that. And also know that there are organizations such as mine, which will gladly perform low-cost security auditing services and consultations. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we still have two more questions. So Yesara would like to know whether regarding how secure or how safe the new WhatsApp policy is. What can you say to that?
I think well, so ultimately that policy it's a move in order to bring WhatsApp into the same wheelhouse as Facebook is already. Ultimately, because WhatsApp and Instagram are owned by Facebook, the company wanted a uniform privacy policy for all of those services so they can further integrate them. I really don't think too much of it. I mean, like, because I'm against, you know, Facebook's privacy policy to begin with. I think it's overly broad. And also, but that said, I'm not surprised that, you know, the same applies to, you know, other properties that they own. And it's one of those things where you just have to cut your losses and accept it if you want to continue using those services.
Okay, there's this question about the recommended app to track a stolen phone.
How to track a stolen phone.
Yes.
Okay. So if you did have like, turn my iPhone on, or sorry, find my iPhone on, that's a way that you can do that, but not a lot of people do so. You can, and also it depends on the phone that you have. For like, there might be hmm. I mean, you can do some like, I guess, kind of deep, investigative work looking at where the phone was, like accessing the internet, for instance. So I told you that like, that providers are always going to know where the phone is because that's how they deliver its service to you. And that might be something that law enforcement would have access to if they were investigating. But otherwise, yeah, you can, like if you had access to knowing exactly what the IP address was of the phone when it was accessed, let's say over Wi-Fi or something like that, then that's a way to find it. However, I don't know what your recourse would be because like you can't necessarily like just go to somebody's house and say like give me back my phone, like that probably might not go well for you. um and I guess finally, like the best thing to do is know that like if your phone is protected with a passcode, then there really isn't very much that someone can do, especially if you have an iPhone, because you do have to like in order to factory reset and to resell a modern iPhone, as long as you're running the current version of it, like you have to supply that passcode, and so that prevents iPhones from being so like valued as a target for theft.
Oh, okay. So the last question is I'm combining two questions. Although a question has just they just sent in another question, but let me just see how far I can combine this. So is the long one? So read. Sit back, relax, and read. Okay. Nowadays, we have to sign up on many websites for studies, networking, communication, and work, and a lot of passwords we need. It's quite difficult to remember every password, and many times forget passwords, especially when we need to open in different devices. Do we have a way to solve it securely? I think you mentioned part of it last week. You can
Yeah.
still
Mhm.
repeat that. So the second part of that question is this: shall we use VPN in our phone, which we are using for mobile banking and financial activities? And Amani also has a slightly related question on VPN, which is this: Amani from Tanzania, is actually are VPNs effectively able to hide your location identity?
Mhm. Those are a lot of cool questions. First off, regarding the passwords, definitely use a password manager that integrates into, across your various devices. So 1Password, for instance, actually has a really cool promotion for journalists. So if you're a journalist, you can get a 1Password account. I think the first year is free, and then afterwards, you pay a subscription. But it's really, really great, and that integrates with all of your devices. So you can have it on your computer, you can have it on your mobile phone. You can even integrate it into your phone's keyboard, if you're comfortable with doing that. So that that erases a lot of that friction with like, oh, different passwords that I can't memorize, blah 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 blah. So definitely do that. As far as the VPN stuff is concerned, the VPN, you can't it whether you can use it with your bank depends on your bank, and it also depends on the VPN. So some banks, like, because if they see someone trying to hide their location, they'll be like, oh, like that's probably fraud, and they'll block you. That's also why it's really, really hard to access your bank over Tor. So don't try to do that. But there are some banks that are, still able to use, whatever they have built into their website in order to like still allow you to use a VPN. And I do personally, like, I have a bank that thankfully does allow that. Um, And so that means it's great because I can also use my VPN on my mobile phone. And I love doing that. My phone is always on a VPN. Um, and as far as like hiding your location, so yes, it does, or rather, the VPN will mask your IP address, which is usually linked to your location, to the service that you're using. But you have to think about like the logistics of that. So one, your VPN knows where you are because you're using their computers and you have to connect to their computers. So if someone, asked your VPN, where is this person's originating IP address, they could give that information up. And that has happened in the past, in legal proceedings. Another thing to think about is that like when you're using a VPN or whatever, your bank knows who you are because you have that bank account. So they might start to associate your that as just like another bit of information that they know about you. That, like this is Harlo, she's in Brooklyn and she's always using this VPN, so we know it's her. So yeah.
Okay, really cool questions coming up. Let's squeeze out 5 more minutes and I will call
Okay.
it a day.
Okay.
Um, okay, so yes or no? Nisoka Makano would like to ask whether VPNs vary from state to state in the United States.
No, it's pretty much the same.
Okay,
With the exception of California, but that has to do mostly with like data privacy.
okay.
So yeah.
Yeah, so the another question from Kira is this, how do you erase your activities on Google, WhatsApp, and Signal?
Mhm. So they depend. You can erase, or sorry, on WhatsApp. WhatsApp has disappearing messages, and you can also just like like leave groups, archive or delete conversations.
Okay.
Signal also allows you to do that. On Google, however, ultimately, well, there's two things. One, there's your local browsing history that's saved on your computer or on your phone, or that you can go into your web browser and make sure that you delete. And then there's also what's called your web and app activity, which is, Google's like storage on their servers, on their
Mm-hmm.
computers of that activity. And you have to go into your account settings and delete those as well. You can, but the cool thing is that you can actually pause it. You can just say like, no, like don't save my location history, don't save my browsing history, so you don't have to worry about it being stored there.
Yeah, okay. The last question, please, guys. Let's make this the last question. Okay. For the past few days, Facebook has been informing me that someone near Accra, Ghana, attempted to log into my account. How do I prevent hackers from logging into my account? Another question just came in.
Okay. Two things. One, is that it's always like pretty scary whenever you get that. But if you have a strong, unique password and two-factor authentication, then they can attempt all they want, but they're not going to get it. They're just not. So trust that having strong, unique passphrases and two-factor authentication on your Facebook account will just frustrate people,
Okay.
as they try. Another thing is to know that sometimes maybe that didn't come from Facebook. Maybe that's actually like a trick. We call that phishing, for somebody to like click on a link and then it brings you to, like what looks like Facebook, but it's actually like book like .ru or something, and then you put in your username and password, and then they now have stolen your username and password. So ultimately what I recommend people to do is, like, if ever you see something like that, if you want to check, instead of clicking on the link, don't do that, but open up a new tab on your browser and just go to Facebook and see if there's anything in your notifications on the right-hand side that needs your attention, if you want to check.
Okay, there is this repeated question that Noah Thompson has brought up again. Where can they get those pouches?
So the one that I have is by a group called Mission Darkness. But you can go to your online provider of choice and buy one. There's no like, yeah, uh, they can be a little bit expensive. Mine costs $60, but it's really, really effective, and I love having it.
Okay, and so I also saw a question on dealing with trolls.
Mm.
So what do you recommend? And so Abusin also raised it, that what advice do you have for one to avoid cyberbullying while staying safe?
Yeah. Um, because we only have so much time, I actually would highly recommend attending any of the sessions that about that are like this long with myself and with Victoria from Penn America. Uh, and I think that we have one coming up. I forget exactly when, but like in coming months, where we talk about all sorts of tactics. Um, Two things. One is like making sure that your accounts are locked down. So like making sure that people can't easily get into, let's say, your Facebook account or your Twitter account or whatever, in order to harass you, and like putting like examining your privacy settings about like how people can find you, because sometimes people will kind of do that in retaliation. Yeah, there's a couple of really, really excellent tactics, but once again, that's going to have to wait for a little bit later. I mean, and also like everybody has their own, responses that they're comfortable with, because it's such a personal issue.
Yeah.
And so like just, you have to think about what you are comfortable with. Do you want to respond? Do you want to set your Instagram profile to private so you can't, so nobody can look at it? Like, do you have friends who, will like give you a hug and tell you it's going to be okay? Like, these are all things that you have to consider.
Yeah, so Shoka's comment is my request is that we need more training if possible, especially on the matter of security and also investigation. And I strongly agree. It's quite obvious that there is a lot of knowledge gaps that still needs to be filled, especially considering the fact that journalists many times are not digital security experts, but individuals that are just trying to get their story written and
Yeah,
get
absolutely.
and investigate stories. So, but it has become really, really important to expand their digital security skills, and it's something that I still believe that is also important to us at the ICFJ, empowering you with tools, insights, and information on how to keep yourself safe, which means that sometimes along the line we'll still be able to bring Hello and colleagues back to also improve on what they've learned. So, but before we go, and so there is something I would like to know from our participants, whether you've identified how to improve your security from this webinar. We want to know if this has really been helpful, if it has been useful to you, and I have not seen anybody that said no, which is really, really good. If you say no, I'm going to come right out of the screen, and so 100%, let me just end it 100%. So everybody said yes, and so everybody said yes, and so I just wanted to say this hello, and so which means you've been extraordinarily, your session has been extraordinarily important, and it has been very useful. And I also personally, even though I'm the one moderating, I've also been able to gain one or two things from what I've learned from you. So we really, really appreciate you for your taking time out to really share your wealth of knowledge with us. And for those that are asking whether we have a WhatsApp group, so what I recommend that you do is you search for go to Facebook and search for the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, and that is where you are going to find where you can still network. I'm trying to get the link. Yes, I have the link to the group. So you can just quickly just click it and be part of our conversation. And one more thing, will you be, hello, is it okay for you to share those slides so that we can share with our participants?
Sure, sure.
So please, once Hello shares with me, I'm going to share it in the group. So that is the direct link to the ICLJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum's Facebook group. That is where we are going to be sharing the slides, and I encourage you to join us and get more information about it. And for more resources for journalism, I encourage you to also check out the IJNet platform. Visit www.ijnet.org for more resources on digital security and other aspects of journalism. So we'll be back next week discussing another topical issue that is very relevant to journalism, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So from me and everybody at the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, I say thank you very much. I do appreciate it, and
Thank
have a lovely
you.
day.